So welcome to the session on case studies and human factors. It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Matt Smith, who is a postdoc at the University of Oxford. And his interests are really quite interesting. So his research focuses on system security in aviation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk to you about some work that we carried out at the University of Oxford in conjunction with Arm Swiss Science and Technology. And the kind of overall gist of the work is that we tried to understand how pilots might be affected by attacks on their aircraft systems. So in aviation, security research has had a real kind of surge in the past decade. And so we've seen a huge number of papers at top-tier conferences, in journals, at hacking conferences, in master's theses, all over the place, really. And they always present some really interesting work. But often they treat the aircraft as a sort of the smallest unit in the system, whereas in reality, you have some pilots who are in control of that aircraft. And so what we wondered is, how well do pilots actually handle these attacks? And this is really interesting because pilots are regularly assessed on how they handle faults. They do this usually every 6 to 12 months in a flight simulator like the one on the right, and it's actually really important to keep them certified and go through this process. And so as a result, they form a sort of last line of defense against any potential accidents or faults. And this is through this well-defined procedure that they develop in these flight simulator tests. So the question is, how well does this fault handling skill translate to mitigating attacks? But also, can we use simulation to try and understand what the impact of these attacks might be in a slightly more granular way? So we decided to do this as a user study. We invited 30 currently type-rated or recently type-rated Airbus A320 pilots to come and fly in our small simulator that we put together, which you see on the right there. And we carried out attacks in the scenarios on collision avoidance systems, ground proximity warning systems, and landing systems. We used X-Plane 11 and a high-quality aircraft model, and the experimenter provided some flying support, but importantly, the pilot was in command, was in control, and the experimenter was only involved at the direct instruction of the pilot. And the protocol was very simple. We started with a familiarization flight so the pilots could get used to the hardware. And then for the 3 attacks, we had a simulated flight including an attack. Then we had a debrief interview about that flight. And then at the end, we had an overall debrief about the experiment. And just a very quick note about our participant demographics. We had a good range of experience. So we had quite a few first officers or senior first officers, but we also had quite a few captains who carried a good bit of experience with them. So before we talk about the attacks, let's first just quickly cover our attacker model. We're not looking at an incredibly destructive attacker here. We're instead looking at someone who is looking to cause delay, maybe some financial loss, or some reputational harm. And they'll do this by triggering perhaps a go-around, which is where an aircraft attempts to land but can't, so has to take a second approach. They might force the aircraft to do maneuvers that they weren't planning to, or they might also push crew to switch systems off. And they'll do this through their understanding of avionics systems and standards, which allows them to build some radio software that enables these attacks. And then this can be deployed to 1 or more locations. The hardware varies slightly between the attacks, but ultimately it's very simple. We're looking at a software-defined radio feeding into an amplifier so we can get the power needed to get these messages to the aircraft, and then using a directional antenna. So I'm only going to talk about 2 of the attacks today for the sake of brevity, but the first attack that we looked at was on the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, or TCAS. Now, TCAS is a really important safety system that aims to prevent mid-air collisions by deconflicting situations that might become a close encounter. So let's say we're flying along in our aircraft. This is called the own ship. And nearby, there's some intruder. Now, this intruder is communicating with air traffic control as other aircraft are, and it does this over a link called mode-S. So at some point, air traffic control will ask the intruder to identify that it's there. And when that happens, the response by the intruder will also be detected by the own ship. And as part of this procedure, the own ship can then, with TCAS, basically can figure out who is nearby, roughly speaking how far they are away, and they can present this to the pilot as in the bottom right there. So let's say the aircraft start to become closer. At some point, the own ship will begin to directly interrogate the intruder. Now, at this point, the TCAS unit will start to predict what the trajectory of the intruder might be. And if this trajectory is not yet a risk of collision, but it's becoming too close, something called a traffic advisory, or a TA, will be issued. All this means is in the cockpit, there'll be an enunciation of traffic, and the pilots will have to get ready, but they don't at this point have to take any immediate action. And then if the aircraft continue to get closer, we have what's called a resolution advisory, or an RA. So in this situation, the aircraft will start to coordinate, and this will be so that they actually do separate when they follow the maneuvers that TCAS instructs them to take. And once this has happened, the instructions from TCAS will be announced in the cockpit. Now, pilots have to follow this instruction. This is compulsory. So in this case, the intruder might climb and the own ship might descend. And TCAS is, generally speaking, is built on the idea that everyone is cooperative and everyone wants to avoid colliding. So we know from previous work that mode S, the link that TCAS operates on, or one of the links, is insecure. And so this means that an attacker can respond to interrogations by the aircraft and inject a false aircraft that is flying towards the real aircraft, or the target aircraft, will initially cause a traffic alert and then eventually cause a resolution advisory. And this will then require avoiding action. So our simulator scenario simulated this multiple times happening to a pilot over the course of a flight. And the aim of the attacker here was to force the pilots to fly repeated unwanted resolution advisories and potentially get them to switch the system off. And generally speaking, that is what happened. So we found that when hit with all these resolution advisories from aircraft that weren't there, 26 of our participants ended up reducing the sensitivity of this key safety system down to only give traffic alerts, with a further 11 almost switching the system off and turning it to standby. And so generally speaking, this happened after around 5, the switch down to TA only happened after about 5 RAs, and standby was a further 2 to 3. And this is really important because this causes a full loss of TCAS for the rest of the flight. And this, in turn, not only is that inconvenient for the pilots, but also increases the burden on air traffic control because now they have to keep greater separation around that aircraft. On top of that, you have the excess fuel burn and inconvenience of following these quite extreme resolution advisory maneuvers, but the pilots just don't have any choice. They have to follow these maneuvers. Some pilots also felt that they had to make further avoiding action maneuvers, so that might be to fly, say, out of clouds to get a better visual picture. But some pilots actually felt they needed to divert back to the origin, and this is an extremely costly action to take, but it was the only thing they felt they could do in the situation. So the takeaway from this part is that attackers can push pilots to fly these unnecessary resolution advisories through these attacks and reduce the sensitivity of TCAS as a result. So if we look at what the participants actually told us when we interviewed them, they kind of figured out something weird was going on because it was not normal to have so many resolution advisories. In fact, one of our pilots, who was a captain, had been flying for 17 years, but had only seen 10 resolution advisories in his entire career. On top of that, they also noted that poor weather would make this much harder to identify. So if you couldn't see out of the cockpit very well, you couldn't do just a simple visual check to see if there was an aircraft in range. We also were told that these repeated RAs would have knock-on effects for other aircrafts because the aircraft then it sort of began to behave unpredictably and was climbing and descending far more than it should have been. And this was a factor in 28 of our participants saying that the attack lowered the safety of the aircraft. And something that was quite concerning was that this push that the pilots felt to reduce the sensitivity of this key safety system because of the distraction sort of felt like it was like a crying wolf effect. So they were concerned that it might affect how they respond to TCAS in future. So the next attack we looked at was on the instrument landing system. This is a very simple analog system in which it aims to help aircraft land following a consistent glide path in many different weather conditions to a consistent point on the runway called the touchdown zone. And so the way it does this is 2 lobes are modulated on a frequency, one at 90 hertz and one at 150 hertz. And the aircraft measures the relative strength of these lobes, and when the strength is equal, then the aircraft's on the correct glide slope. This is part of a bigger landing system, but because this system is analog and doesn't have any kind of security mechanism in place, the attack is fairly simple. We have an attacker who transmits a false glide path from the far end of the runway. And in this scenario, the aim is to basically make the touchdown zone far too deep into the runway. And at any given point, the distance between the real glide slope and the false glide slope is about 350 feet, which is noticeable, especially as you get closer to the runway, but isn't necessarily noticeable when you say 8 to 10 miles away. So it's quite a subtle attack. The idea is that the aircraft might intercept the glide slope from above, or the attacker might overpower the real glide slope, thus capturing them on this false glide slope, leaving them too high to land. And this is very similar to some very good work that was presented at Usenix last year, where they attacked the localizer. So the aim here is to have the aircraft overshoot the runway and abort the approach or land deep. So participants identify consistently, though, there was a problem with ILS, and 26 of them aborted their first approach. They also then went on to take a huge range of different approach mechanisms on the second approach that they eventually landed on. And the point at which this go-around happened usually was at the last point that you can do a go-around, which is about a minute to land or about 100 feet above the runway. In the cases where the pilots did try to correct, they had to make what was a very steep correction that was on the limits of what they would be able to do, which isn't always possible. So again, attackers could push pilots here to miss an approach and abandon the glide slope, even though it's a very important system. So if you look at what participants told us about this, they identified there was an issue and they lost confidence in the glide slope. But as a result, this was unlikely to work beyond this first approach. And also, something that we didn't think about was how important runway lighting was. They told us that these lights on the right-hand side were actually critical in identifying that an attack was underway, because normally you would have 2 red and 2 white, and that wasn't the case on their approach. But the consequence is in that poor weather, they might not actually spot, they might not be able to see these lights properly or have a good visual reference to the runway, so it'd be far harder to identify this attack. Furthermore, low fuel situations wouldn't give them the benefit necessarily of making multiple approaches on the glide slope, so they will maybe have one approach and wouldn't have a lot of time to figure out what the issue is. There was also concern about the kind of short glide slope, or the die-hard scenario, that would mean that the aircraft would land before the runway. And also, as I mentioned, this kind of range of second approach methods suggests uncertainty, though experience with glide slope misbehaving in the past did help here. So what did we find overall? Well, generally, if attacks cause spurious alarms, the system will be turned off. And so attackers could force pilots away from these systems by attacking them, even if the systems were important to safety. On top of that, attacks had real potential for disruption, even though specific disruption was quite hard to predict. And so it kind of implies that there is a certain element of unpredictability in what the ultimate system impact will be. Participants were very quick to identify unusual behavior, which suggests that existing procedure is a very good base on which we can build to handle security incidents. But also, participants told us that the attack success depends on wider system effects, things like traffic, weather, air traffic control load, or even pilot tiredness. So what did we learn from this study? First of all, diagnosis is key. The procedure got them almost all the way to handling the attack. But often there was a grey area, and that grey area is where people really chose different approaches, and that is not the normal way that aviation operates. Also, we found that simulation was absolutely invaluable to our results, because we could allow scenarios to unfold that we wouldn't have spotted in our paper-based analysis. And so this was hugely useful in getting a much better picture of the impact. And also, probably the most important thing to this community is that real usage really matters in these big, complex systems where humans are involved. They can mitigate the attack or they can amplify the attack, but the only way you can actually figure out what this effect might be is by analyzing how they use the system in reality. So just to wrap up, these attacks can cause disruption even when pilots can mitigate part of the attack. And the responses took a variety of forms, which often in turn led to unpredictability and then makes it harder to defend against some of these attacks. In many cases, attacks pushed pilots to disable safety-related systems, even though these systems were very important. But existing procedure provides a good starting point from which we can build and hopefully add that extra little bit of kind of security knowledge to handle these attacks should they happen. So that's all from me. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Joshua Smith, BYU Hawaii. This sounds really interesting as a pilot myself, as well as a technologist. I'm wondering, did you consider any type of progressive TCAS deterioration where the pilot is initially exposed to something that gives a very minor, subtle difference, but then progressively becomes more worse, such as a collision deterrence for elevation problems with mountainous terrain or anything?
So
and then the second question is just, do you know, does GPS have some of the same security deficiencies that we see in a localizer and TCAS?
GPWS, was that
the GPS? So
GPS, okay, yeah, sorry, because we do touch on both. So just on your TCAS point, in this study, we didn't look at gradual degradation, though we that actually sort of happened because after a few resolution advisories, they would turn the system down to TA only and then eventually off. Though that is a very interesting way of attacking the system that we are doing some work on now to try and understand whether that's possible. In terms of GPS, it's not straightforward to attack GPS on aircraft because they do have some integrity mechanisms, but it's also not beyond the question. And the worrying thing there is that there's an increasing trust in the system that, you know, I would say, for example, the new ground proximity warning system, GPWS, is treated as kind of gospel because it uses GPS and a terrain database. So we didn't, in this study, look at GPS, but it is a really important factor in these things because it is actually trusted, even though it's just using normal civilian GPS. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, David Ballinson with SRI International. Very interesting topic, very interesting talk. I'm curious, you used the term attacks. What is it that the pilots understood that they were going to be encountering at the beginning of the study, and that they realized they were attacks, or did they think that there were other types of anomalies or failures?
So this is a very good question. So we didn't have access to a pool of pilots that we could reliably recruit from. So we had to convince them to come to us on their day off. So we did tell them that this was a study on security. We didn't go into detail about the systems or any of the methods of the attacks or anything like that in advance. So they did know that they were handling this. They didn't know when the attacks would come. So we tried to inform them enough so that we could give them something to be interested in to come to do the study with us. But we tried to make sure that we didn't tell them too much such that we would kind of give the game away.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.